Welcome to the third Pediatric Device Innovators Forum. I'm Anthony Sandler. I am the Senior Vice President and Surgeon-in-Chief of the Joseph E. Robert Jr. Center for Surgical Care, and I'm also the Director of the Sheikh Zayed Institute for Pediatric Surgical Innovation at Children's National Hospital. When we established the Sheikh Zayed Institute approximately 10 years ago, we did so with a mission to make pediatric surgery less invasive, pain-free, and more precise. And the topic of today's forum directly resonates with that mission. The MR HIFU program that we established at Children's with the philanthropic gift really speaks to making pediatric surgery less invasive, more precise, and pain-free.
Nobody likes having surgery, but it can be especially scary for children. Now, though, doctors here in Washington are using ultrasound to destroy tumors without the surgery.
The program has completed a study on osteoid osteoma that has now received FDA approval thanks to the patients treated at Children's National. So in closing, I just want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for participating today. I want to thank the National Capital Consortium for Pediatric Device Innovation, specifically Kalale Eskandanian, as well as Bill Bentley from the University of Maryland, for making the symposium happen and for their leadership in the NCC PDI. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sally Elaine. I'm part of Johnson & Johnson Innovation and head of J Labs at Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you all to today's Pediatric Device Innovators Forum being held live here at J Labs at Washington, D.C. J Labs is a state-of-the-art research and development infrastructure designed to help accelerate startups on the cusp of innovation, intent on transforming the future of healthcare for all of us. Our site is open to entrepreneurs and innovators focused on innovation across the healthcare spectrum, including pharmaceuticals, medical devices, consumer products, and health technology. J Labs at Washington, D.C. is the first J Labs site anchored with a global leader in pediatric research and medicine, and it's the second time that Johnson & Johnson family of companies and Children's National have teamed up to emphasize the importance of investing in the health and well-being of our children and babies around the world. Last year, J Labs at Washington, D.C. awarded NCC PDI winner Hopscotch Residency, and it's been so exciting to see their growth and potential. I look forward to today's discussion, and I welcome you all to today's forum.
Welcome to the third Pediatric Device Innovators Forum on the topic of focused ultrasound for pediatric indications. I'm Kalale Eskandanian with the National Capital Consortium for Pediatric Device Innovation, a collaboration of Children's National Hospital and University of Maryland, Fischel Institute for Biomedical Devices. It's my pleasure to be your MC today. This forum is a collaboration between the FDA and the 5 FDA-funded PDC device consortia. It's a collaborative educational experience hosted by the FDA consortia and designed to connect and foster synergy among innovators across the device development ecosystem interested in pediatric indications. There will be 3 sections to today's forum. First, we're going to start with a keynote fireside chat, followed by 2 panel discussions. Please use the Q&A section in webinar to post your questions. We will do our best to answer all the questions, and if not, we will follow up with you with a Q&A list. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our fireside chat speakers, Dr. Michael Anderson, Senior Advisor to HHS Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, ASPR, and Children's National Hospital, and Dr. Jessica Foley, Chief Scientific Officer at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation.
Thank you for the introduction. Dr. Foley, welcome to Children's National. Great to have you here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here.
So we have, and I think, a really incredible forum ahead. And I sort of wanted to start with just some high-level thoughts on focused ultrasound. I will also note that we mentioned, as before we started, this is our first in-person academic sort of trial in a while. So it's good to be amongst people and talking about really important topics. I've been a pediatrician for almost 30 years, and I always say there's good news and bad news. The good news is the very few children across this country will need high-tech things like MRI and neurosurgeons. But the bad news is, because there's such a small number, thank God, there's so many challenges that we face when bringing innovation in the pediatric space. And I'm just proud that we're in this physically amazing Children's Research and Innovation Center, and we can bring terrific folks like you together. So let's start really around the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, its roots, its history, and really what it's all about.
Yeah, sure. And it's great to be here with you. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this event. The Focused Ultrasound Foundation was created in 2006. And, we're dedicated to advancing the development and clinical adoption of focused ultrasound for many different clinical applications. So focused ultrasound has over 150 different clinical indications that are in various stages of development. Some of those are pediatrics, but those are some of the newer indications. So in terms of FDA approvals, it's been approved for essential tremor, for Parkinson's tremor, for uterine fibroids, painful bone metastases, prostate tissue ablation, and then most recently, the first pediatric indication in osteoid osteoma, which we'll talk about a little later. And so the foundation, through our history, has really noticed that there's this great technology and there's a potential for it to treat so many patients, but most people have never heard of it. Even for things that are FDA approved, clinicians may not know about it to offer it to their patients. Patients may not know about it, and even if they do, it may not be covered by insurance. So there's a lot of big challenges to face to really get this to patients. And so that's really why the foundation is here, is to try to identify and break down as many of those barriers as possible to get this out to patients.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And your foundation is not only an advocacy group. We've got to get word out to clinicians. I also noticed you have a funding mechanism, you have an advocacy mechanism. So speak a little about how those parts of the foundation work.
Yeah, so we're very similar to in operation maybe to a disease foundation like a Michael J. Fox Foundation, except that we're not focused on just one disease. Again, we're looking at this technology, this cross-cutting technology. But we do funding of medical research. That's a big part of what we do. So we fund first in human clinical trials as well as translational preclinical research. And we identify, what are the big critical unmet needs clinically out there that potentially focused ultrasound could treat. And we've seen that there's a lot of potential in cancer, glioblastoma, pancreatic cancer, for instance, neurological disorders, Alzheimer's, ALS, and then pediatric indications. And so those are some of our focus areas, and that's where we direct a lot of our funding. But we do a lot of other things, as you just alluded to. We do a lot of advocacy and kind of government relations, trying to, we think that the only way for focused ultrasound to become this widespread, clinically adopted treatment that all patients have access to is if everyone is involved in sort of advancing it, right? And so it's other foundations. So we collaborate a lot with the disease foundations. We want them to know that here's this treatment that could help the patients that you care most about. So we co-fund projects with them. We set up workshops, and we'll invite them to the workshops along with our investigators and really try to tackle how can we treat DIPG. We're having a workshop in October on DIPG. So that would be bringing all the leaders in the field as well as those that are just experts that we think should be involved in the discussion, and then try to build the roadmap to move forward. So we're always doing a lot to try to foster collaboration. And then I think we're really trying to build relationships with the FDA, with the government funders. We still could use a lot more federal funding for focused ultrasound, particularly in the newer areas of research, whether it's pediatrics, whether it's using focused ultrasound to induce an immune response, which is a big area of application right now that we're focused on, or neuromodulation for non-invasive treatment of all sorts of things. So we want to get the funders knowing about it and funding it. And then there's more and more regulatory submissions coming to FDA and then going to CMS. So we think those folks really need to be educated and involved in being collaborative partners with us.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I noticed something in your career as well. You not only have a PhD in science, but you've also done a lot of public policy work. And if there's one thing that drives Children's National, it's of course take great care of patients, educate the next generation of PhDs or MDs, do world-class research, but also advocate that kids really need a strong voice, whether it's a foundation or industry or healthcare. Just talk to me briefly, if you will, how your background in public policy helps drive the agenda for the foundation, because I think that's a really interesting mix.
Yeah, well, I think it's, we see this big world within the biomedical ecosystem. There's all these different stakeholders involved, whether it's government, whether it's foundations, academia, industry. Everyone has their sort of own agenda and timelines, so to speak. And it's about how are you, if we want to promote focused ultrasound, we can find touch points with all of those different stakeholders in terms of why they should care about it, why it's important for what they're trying to do. And so I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do in advocacy is just, with all of those different groups, advocate on behalf of this technology and really on behalf of patients, because that's who's going to benefit. And, you talk about, obviously, for Children's National, and that public policy is a big part of it. Well, when we think about kids, and you and I were talking about this a little earlier, kind of the rare disease aspect of it. There's so few children that may be suffering from these different diseases that they're kind of viewed as a rare disease. And so from a company standpoint, how do you, encourage them to invest in these areas that may not be as marketable for them? Or how do you get, Congress people to pay attention, or NIH to fund this area? And so I think that, we've had that challenge just with focused ultrasound in general. But I think when you get to the pediatric aspect of it, it really is going to take a lot of advocacy to get folks to realize that this is really important.
We have been dealing with the notion of therapeutic orphans, the term therapeutic orphans, so I really don't like, but it sticks, since I was in training, that the great majority of drugs I give as an intensive care doc are not labeled for use in kids because the companies haven't studied them in kids, because the number is so small. That number is better now because of innovative things like the Best Pharmaceutical Acts. So my point is that this strong clinical care research and advocacy / education agenda is how we're going to get better. And I'm just so impressed with your foundation. It also takes interesting spokespeople, because we're scientists, we're in the business, but I was fascinated researching your foundation that John Grisham is a big backer and actually wrote a book around the notion of focused ultrasound. Could you sort of speak on his work?
Yeah, well, so John Grisham is a wonderful supporter of the foundation. He's been on the board of directors with the foundation for many years. And several years ago, he was sort of thinking about what he could do that would really make the biggest impact for focused ultrasound in the foundation, and realized, well, he can tell a really great story. And so he decided to write this short book called The Tumor. And it really kind of follows, it might seem like science fiction, but it's not, following what is now the situation for a young father with glioblastoma. Unfortunately, it's not good. And he could get chemotherapy, he could get surgery, but unfortunately, it's not going to prolong his life much, and the side effects are going to be terrible. So what could happen with focused ultrasound? We're not to the point yet where he could be cured with focused ultrasound, but he definitely could have his life prolonged. And as we'll learn about later with some of the drug delivery capabilities of focused ultrasound, he could perhaps get that chemotherapy, but with much less side effects. And so that could mean that he'd have a better quality of life to spend with his family. And so this is a great story in and of itself, but coming from John Grisham, sure, I mean, it's done a tremendous benefit to the foundation in terms of raising awareness of focused ultrasound, the foundation, and all of that is benefiting patients because we're able to get the word out, more.
That's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, on behalf of Children's National, I'm just so appreciative of your time for this incredible forum that we're about to put on. Give me a notion, 3 years from now, we come back to this beautiful space and all of your dreams for focused ultrasound are starting to be realized. What does 3 years from now look like?
Well, I think that, again, as we're going to talk about some of the drug delivery applications of focused ultrasound. I think we're just on the cusp now of seeing how focused ultrasound can safely open the blood-brain barrier to enable more targeted delivery of high concentrations of drugs like chemotherapies, like immunotherapies, other drugs. And I think that's going to be huge for all different diseases, but I think definitely in pediatrics. I think we're going to be able to make some progress there in terms of brain tumors. I also think that the cancer immunotherapy opportunity using ultrasound combined with cancer immunotherapies is huge. And so I think what we have to do is we have to get the funding going to fund all of this initial research, and then, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, there's going to be regulatory barriers, challenges, there's going to be insurance coverage challenges, particularly when you're dealing with drug device combinations and particularly when you're dealing with children. So I think we're going to have to tackle all of those, but I'm optimistic that we will be able to do that and that we'll come back here in a few years and have at least another pediatric indication approved and have, more of these clinical trials ongoing.
I look forward to that celebration.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and
All right.
let's get on to the forum.
Okay.
So we're going to continue with our first panel case study on MR HIFU, high intensity focused ultrasound for pediatric indications. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, Dr. Karun Sharma, Children's National Hospital. Arun Menewat, CEO of Profound, is joining us remotely. Francesca Joseph from Children's National Hospital. Gordon Schatz from Schatz Reimbursement, and Stephen Nagel from CDRH FDA is also joining us remotely. We're going to start this panel by asking Dr. Sharma to provide a brief background about the osteoid osteoma as the indication that was used in clinical trials at Children's National, and the use of MR HIFU to treat this disease.
Thank you, Kalali. I'll start with a little bit of background. I think Jessica introduced it as well. MR HIFU is a novel therapy that really can benefit children because it is completely non-invasive. It can be performed without any radiation, and it can be used to treat localized tumor that cause pain. And the advantages of MR HIFU over other therapy alternatives such as surgery or radiation or chemotherapy, obviously, is that the side effects are not there from chemotherapy and radiation, and it can be performed completely non-invasively, so there's very little collateral damage to the surrounding tissues. The way that the technology works is that it marries MRI imaging. MRI imaging is performed in children without any radiation, and focused ultrasound. And the focused ultrasound transducer generates sound waves that cause heat, but only in the area that's focused on the target. And so that is the technology, and it has great benefit and potential for pediatric populations where radiation has downstream negative effects, chemotherapy has, and surgery has immediate negative effects potentially. With this technology, we focused on, as an initial application, osteoid osteoma. And for those of you who may not know, osteoid osteoma is a benign and very focal and localized bone tumor, about 10% of all benign bone tumors. And it causes a very characteristic pain for the patient. The initial treatment is usually with drugs called NSAIDs, such as Advil and ibuprofen and Motrin. And that causes some temporary relief, but it's not a durable relief. And long-term use of these medications can have side effects. The gold standard for this treatment or for permanent relief is really CT-guided radiofrequency ablation. And while that's a good alternative, it exposes the patient to radiation. It also is invasive because it requires drilling from the skin through muscle and bone to place a probe and actually burn the lesion. MR HIFU represents a way to do all of that, but completely non-invasively and without the radiation. So we chose this indication early on and performed a clinical trial at Children's. We have the Sonolive device, which is made by Profound, and we treated 9 patients in this trial. All 9 patients had complete and sustained and durable pain relief, and we've now followed them out to 5 years. No further medication use after a few days after the treatment, and no side effects. And based on these results, we were able to apply for an NIH grant, which is now funding the next 30 patients for a second trial. In terms of the approval of the device and for pediatrics specifically, as Jessica mentioned earlier, there are several adult FDA-approved indications, but despite the compelling reasons to use this technology in pediatrics, the first approved FDA-approved indication was granted in November of 2020 for osteoid osteoma under a humanitarian device exemption.
Great. Thank you so much, Karun. Can you talk to us about some of the challenges that you faced with respect to recruiting and retaining human subjects, patients for this study?
Sure. I think some of the challenges begin with the fact that osteoid osteoma is not a very common disease. You know, other diseases that are out there that cause localized pain, bone pain, are very common, such as arthritis and other things. But osteoid osteoma, we may have somewhere around 5,000 cases per year. And so recruiting patients from that perspective can be challenging. The other challenges that we encountered for early safety and feasibility type of study was also in terms of getting started and getting approval and the funding that was needed to perform the study, because right now, as I said earlier, no insurance company is paying for this treatment. And so we were very fortunate and thankful to the Sheikh Zayed Institute and Children's National because their initial seed funding was essential to performing this clinical trial. And now we have the NIH grant. Will hopefully continue to gain more experience with it.
Thank you so much. We're going to go remote and ask Arun to tell us about how he went about adapting the device for the pediatric population. Arun?
Thank you, Kalali. You know, I think that for us as a company, there were really 2 driving things, and Jessica Foley and Dr. Sharma have already talked about it a little bit. One was that this is a treatment that requires no radiation, and Dr. Sharma kind of coached me early on that, you know, these are young adults, these are young people, and radiation could have long-term impact, and they have long lives to live. And that really had a big impact on me. The second one was that in treating one of the patients, happened to have been in Europe, the feedback that I received was this was a teenager who was really in severe pain, went through the procedure, walked out of the MR and said, wow, where's the incision? This is like Star Trek therapy. And it really made a difference to me. And so we partnered with Dr. Sharma. We looked at what information, what clinical data that existed. We worked interactively with the FDA, and they talked about the fact that we actually needed to go back and do some preclinical safety work, which took us about a year to perform. And then we discussed all the safety related additional hardware changes and software changes that we needed to make to the device. So I think as Dr. Sharma is talking about, the number of patients here is relatively small, but the impact of this technology is huge. And that is what was driving us to enter this market.
Arun, also tell us, please, about what post-market strategies have you implemented in collecting data post-approval?
That's a great question. So we are looking to have a full registry, and we would be monitoring the patients, and we would follow them, for up to 5 years, which is what would help us understand if there's any additional treatments needed. We think this is a very important technology, and I think being able to establish 5-year data would be an important aspect of driving adoption of the technology.
Francesca, can you talk to us about the marketing pathway, the regulatory pathway, and whether the HDE HUD pathway was the only one for
Sure. Just to back up to some basics. So the US has a risk-based classification for medical devices. So in this case, the focused ultrasound is a class 3, so that's the highest risk. So the two marketing pathways, one would be the PMA or pre-market application, which requires demonstration of safety and effectiveness to get to market. And then the alternative pathway is the humanitarian device exemption pathway. So that's what was utilized here. And it's really for rare diseases. So as we talked about, osteoid osteoma is rare, and it's primarily a pediatric disease in this case, but just the numbers overall are rare. So in order to go the route of a PMA, the amount of patients you'd have to enroll in a clinical trial would be prohibitive in this case. There's just not enough patients out there. So this alternative pathway exists, and the legal definition is the device has to be intended to benefit patients who have a disease or condition that occurs in no more than 8,000 individuals in the US per year. So in this case, the osteoid osteoma qualified. And then you're demonstrating safety and probable benefit in your marketing application.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And Dr. Stephen Nagel from CDRH FDA was the medical officer who reviewed this application. So we're going remote to Dr. Nagel and ask him to please walk us through the FDA approach in determining the benefit risk determination with respect to this rare pediatric indication, and what evidence was considered to support that determination.
Thank you. Since we're remote, I'll just ask quickly, can everybody hear me okay? So yes, my name is Stephen Nagel, and I'm a surgical oncologist and a medical officer in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And I'd like to start by saying thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be invited to this panel. I'd also like to start off by providing some recognition to two individuals who had conflicts and couldn't be here. Really should have been. I was the low on the totem pole, but Dr. Jackie Francis, our pediatrician medical officer, and Dr. Benita Asher, our director, provided not only guidance, but substantive direction to move this submission to approval. So their leadership on this application was instrumental, to say the least. In answering your question with regards to benefit risk considerations, let me just start with some important differences that we would consider in the pediatric device development that would apply not only to therapeutic devices, but to diagnostic devices as well. For example, in consideration of this particular application, there could have been any number of other types of ablative devices other than high-intensity focused ultrasound. It could have applied to a microwave device, an electroporation device, a cryotherapy device, but not to a radiofrequency device for reasons that have been somewhat explained earlier, and I'd be delighted to go into the regulatory reasons for that if time permits it, if anybody has particular questions. But with regards to important differences in the pediatric device benefit risk consideration, we look at special populations, rare diseases, and limited treatments and limitations of the available therapeutic alternatives, and basically the unmet needs. So to help answer this question, let me please just take you for a minute through the seat that I was in when I went through the review of this application. And so as we heard from Dr. Sharma, and incidentally, Dr. Sharma, I must say again, it was really a pleasure working with you. The responsiveness of your team and the data that you provided really made this thing go forward. So the proposed indication for use drove the consideration that we asked in the benefit risk determination. And that proposed indications for use was that the system was intended to be used for treatment of osteoid osteoma. And there were actually a number of different feasibility studies under this submission. There was a study for palliation of bone pain. There was a study for the ablation of refractory pediatric solid tumors. And there was a study, of course, for the ablation of the osteoid osteoma that had 9 patients recruited and treated. There was also a compassionate use protocol for the treatment of a child with desmoid tumor at Children's National Medical Center. But this particular osteoid osteoma population was for patients under 25 years old, 9 subjects enrolled and treated. The results showed no device failures, and none of the treatments were interrupted. The safety results reported no serious adverse events and 15 adverse events. So no serious adverse events and 15 adverse events. And all of the adverse events were transitory, and the character of those adverse events were predominantly as expected or non-unexpected, pain, and mild to moderate and transient. The effectiveness results showed that pain decreased or resolved. There was a reduction in NSAID use, which is a particular benefit and also important to consider risk benefit, that I'll go into. And pain associated with sleep interruption decreased. So how do we go through the risk benefit assessment, which would inform the risk benefit determination? So fundamentally, the benefit risk speaks to whether the probable benefit of the device outweighs the probable risks, and that the device would provide a clinically meaningful benefit, which results in a significant proportion of the target population based upon the totality of the valid scientific evidence. So, first question we ask for the assessment of the benefit, is there any evidence of clinical benefit? And that should be based upon the assessment of the data. And it's for any of the data sets, including associated real-world evidence. And the probable benefit should be considered for any oncology study in terms of how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And let me just remind you that it's almost impossible to take my surgical oncology hat off when I'm sitting in the regulatory review chair. And the goals of a surgical oncologist are a duad: to cure disease whenever possible, and to relieve pain and suffering always. So when we talk about cure, we talk about survival, but this wasn't a survival study. And that's why it didn't have to be a randomized controlled trial. We're looking for at least a favorable change in a clinical assessment that's at least equal or greater to a controlled group, and we didn't need that because it wasn't a survival study. And we're looking to changes that are equal or to greater than changes that are seen in other available modalities for the disease or for the condition. And we heard Dr. Sharma explain what the results of radiofrequency ablation are. And we look at, whenever a physician speaks to a patient, we don't look at the risks and benefits of 2 choices. We explain it, or I explain it to my patient with the umbrella story. there are 4 options. You bring the umbrella, it doesn't rain. You don't bring the umbrella, it doesn't rain. You bring the umbrella, it rains. You don't bring the umbrella, it rains. So there's 4 outcomes. And so in this particular case, you're looking at the effectiveness of RFA and you're looking at the risks of RFA when you're comparing that to the risks and the benefits of the subject device. And we look at what would be meaningful to patients considering the severity, the chronicity of the condition. And so when we assess risk, we look at what are the known probable risks for the device itself or for the procedural use of the device, and are they more than minimal? Now, that's how we assess risk benefit, and how in this case do we get to the benefit risk determination. To approve an HDE application, the FDA has to make, among other things, a determination that the device will not expose the patients to an unreasonable or a significant risk of injury or illness, and that the probable benefit to the health from the use of the device outweighs the probable risk of injury or illness from its use, taking into account the probable benefits and risks of the currently available devices or alternative forms of treatment. And that was really important in this case. But basically, look, the treatment can't be worse than the disease. It has to have the treatment has to have a lower adverse event profile than the disease. So it's got to be tolerable, and any unintended injury has to be tolerable and transient and not disabling. So in addition to considering the extent of the probable benefits and risks for the device, we look at appropriateness of risk mitigations and the perceptions of patients regarding the uncertainty about the probable benefits of a device. So the degree of need related to the public health, for example, the benefit risk profile of what their options are, and also the seriousness of the health condition, and what proportion of patient population for whom the positive benefit risk profile exists. And what really hit home for me in this case was, and really how I used it to present this, was that children have a very different component of fear than adults do, and that adults may not always appreciate. And the way I say it basically is that the view from the bullfighting ring is very different on the outside. So we take that and we look at what can we do with this to move this? What is the likely impact of mitigation strategies such as labeling that might contribute to a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness? And the nature of the decision being made. For example, more uncertainty is likely to exist for a device's benefit risk profile based on the evidence submitted in an HDE application compared with a PMA, because the standards are different for the approval. And so those are the high level considerations. And if anybody is interested in how we went through those considerations for this particular submission, I'd be happy to go through that if there are questions or time.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We're going to switch gears and talk about reimbursement. So Gordon, can you tell us when is the right time to start reimbursement advocacy?
Thank you, Kalal. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel. And I congratulate you and Children's on including reimbursement along with the regulatory, sort of the commercial development and the scientific, because reimbursement fits in with all of those features of product and innovative development. And your question about when to start the reimbursement process follows very naturally and critically from what we just heard about the regulatory process, because typically there are certain triggers during that regulatory process which create opportunities. Before I get into the details, let me also lay out that there are 3 key reimbursement targets: coverage, codes, and payment. And all of these can emerge as the regulatory process does. Let me just stick, if I may, with coverage. And if there are questions or if you want me to go into coding and payment, we can do that as well. And for pediatric problems, there are unique challenges. In the Medicare program for senior citizens, during the FDA investigational device exemption, we heard from Francesca, there can be a PMA, HDE, but prior to the PMA, there frequently is an investigational stage. Under the Medicare program, you can start coverage then. It's a tremendous opportunity, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have seen that this is a starting point to provide coverage and some payment. But certainly with the FDA approval, that opens up some other opportunities. But I would note, and perhaps this is crucial, FDA approval, whether it's an HDE or a PMA or a 510K, is often not adequate to get reimbursement, to get coverage in particular. And we heard a lot about risk benefit, certain kinds of clinical data. The payers expect data that is going to show not just safety, not just efficacy, not just improved benefit over risk, but that there is frequently a substantial improvement in net health outcomes. That data is crucial. It's not easy to get. And my suggestion to answer your question is start early. Start early in the regulatory process. Start during the clinical trials so you can design those clinical trials to gather net health outcomes data, which will be very important. Last point about coverage, Kolala, is that unlike with the regulatory process, developers have the distinct advantage of dealing almost exclusively with the FDA. There's one key agency, and they have been through this a lot. Their knowledge of the data can often be a function of looking at other kinds of focused, high-intensity focused ultrasound. In the reimbursement world, number one, there are multiple players. There's Medicaid for the indigent, Blue Cross Blue Shield, managed care like United Healthcare and Aetna. And so in starting the process, when can you start reimbursement? It's often when can you start the discussion, the engagement with payers? And my suggestion is the earlier, the better, when you have some science that shows that improved net health outcome. Even if you haven't finished the trials, even if you haven't got all the publications, start early.
Thank you so much. For device innovators that are watching, listening, can you also elaborate on, you already touched on that, but what other arguments they can make to make their case very strong?
What are the other arguments that a device developer can make to improve the likelihood they're going to get coverage? In this case, HDE, I think, is a very important part. In the concept of an orphan drug and an orphan device, I think suggests to payers they followed a regulatory pathway because there's a small population and that there is a high need. And so I think trying to make that case to payers is an important part of what else do you need to get, what can that engagement be. Capturing, I think, the critical benefits to an individual patient. A case study is not proof of coverage, but it's often where you want to start. And when you get a pediatric patient, a young child that really has obtained the benefit of this, that becomes a story as to why the payer should cover it. Because in that young patient, the doctor, the hospital were successful in achieving improved net health outcomes.
Thank you so much, Gordon. And who should be part of the team that crafts this reimbursement strategy?
The team should have all of the interested parties to this issue. I would start off with the doctors. They're critical in making the decision to treat this patient with this technology. They may also be part of the research team, so they're gathering data. They may be authors on the publications. So I think the doctors are crucial on the scientific side. The manufacturer of the device, they've developed the underlying science, and they have a voice in this debate. But candidly, many of the payers prefer to hear from the doctors manufacturers. They prefer to hear from people who are deep in the clinical process, but the manufacturers should have a voice there. That's probably the second. I think the hospital's getting paid. And when you, as a facility, are asking for reimbursement to cover the cost of that technology, the hospital has standing on this issue as well. And the last item, and we heard, I didn't even know that there was a focused ultrasound foundation. That's tremendous because they represent, in some cases, the families, the patients, and they certainly have a voice. That's part of the team.
Great. Thank you so much, Gordon. We got some very good questions from the audience. Some submitted their questions ahead of time. So I'm going to pick one for Karun to tell us what are some of the unmet needs other than osteoid osteoma that you elaborate on that are good candidates for pediatric ultrasound technology.
Well, great question, Kalali. So, we mentioned earlier that our program started with osteoid osteoma as an initial application, and we've been very successful with that. But since that time, we've also expanded into pediatric cancers that are malignant, sarcoma being a major type of cancer that we're evaluating. I think it was mentioned that desmoid tumors are also another application. There are several unmet needs. One of the things that we are looking at, these are specific disease processes, more challenging to treat than osteoid osteoma. Often we see patients who've already had chemotherapy and surgery and radiation and are at a point where there aren't any great options. So there, the clinical unmet need is definitely there. The other sort of thing that I want to talk about that came about when we looked at mechanisms of pain relief in osteoid osteoma, as well as in other tumors like desmoid tumors, is that this technology is ideally situated to sort of address the problem of localized pain relief. And really, if you look at the mechanism, we're talking about sensory denervation. We're talking about the pain mediating region, and in this case for osteoid osteoma, the periosteal nerves just on the top of the bone. Once those are ablated or treated very non-invasively in this case, then the pain relief is gone. It's done. We also need to treat the underlying what we call nidus. We didn't go into that, but all of those things can be done very well with this technology safely and under close and strict imaging guidance and monitoring. So we can take what we've learned and continue to, in my opinion anyway, I think attack diseases that are harder to treat often and don't have more, I guess, ideal options. And I think Dr. Packer's also going to talk about a whole entire different set of that. But in the body, we're looking at cancers, we're looking at pain that's unrelated to osteoid osteoma, but pain relief that can be obtained from denervation.
Thank you so much, Karun. It's fascinating, and it's so good to know that there are alternatives to surgery for kids who need it most. With that, I would like to thank all the panel members, our remote participants, Dr. Menewat and Dr. Nagel, as well as everyone who came on site. Thank you so much. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back with our second panel. Welcome back. We're going to continue with our second case, MR-guided low-intensity focused ultrasound for pediatric indications. To my immediate right, Dr. John Vandenenker with Children's National Hospital and Dr. Roger Packer, also with Children's National Hospital, are here on site. And joining us remotely are Dr. Arjun Desai from Insighttec and Mary Daymont from Children's National Hospital as well. So we're going to start with Dr. Roger Packer giving us a synopsis and background about the indication that here at Children's National, we will be working on to use MR LIFU very soon, hopefully. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to be here and participate. To put this into some kind of context, pediatric brain tumors, although not that common, are the most common form of tumor in childhood that causes death and significant morbidity. So we're dealing with a fairly serious problem. And there are various pediatric brain tumors that we've made progress in over the past 2 decades. But the one that for the past quarter century, probably longer than that, where we've made no progress is a tumor called the diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. And that is a tumor that lies in the middle of the brain, deep in the brain, in the centers where the centers control heart rate, breathing, arm and leg function, eye movements exist. Also, it's a tumor that, unlike many that grow like balls, grow like snakes intertwining in the middle of the brain. And because of where the tumor is, if it's left unchecked, it will slowly, and that's part of the misery of it, slowly take away a child's ability to walk, to talk, to use their eyes, and ultimately to breathe. And it's a terrible disease. Now, unfortunately, because it sits in the middle of the brain stem, an area called the pons, if you try to remove it, you will essentially kill the patient. And even taking more than a small bit of it can cause significant neurologic problems that are irreversible. So for many years, really the only way to try to attempt to take care of this condition was to radiate it, give radiation to the tumor. And first of all, you don't want to do that to a child whose brain is developing, but probably more importantly, the radiation, although it worked for a while, didn't work very well. And within 18 months, 90 to 95% of children diagnosed with this entity will have died. To try to supplement or make things better than radiation alone, we've for years tried to do many different things. We've tried to increase the dose of radiation, and all we did was hurt more children from radiation toxicity. We tried to add chemotherapy, and it didn't work. And although in an animal model of the same disease it might work, it never worked in children. And then ultimately, one of the reasons we think it didn't work is because the tumor is smart, and it creates a barrier between itself and the bloodstream called the blood-brain barrier. And as we give drugs either by mouth or intravenously, it can't get to the tumor. So you have very few choices in that case. You could try to give very high doses of chemotherapy, but that causes lots of side effects. And even those kind of therapies didn't really change the course of illness. We couldn't get the drug in high enough. You could try to deliver the therapy directly into the tumor, and there's elaborate systems called convection delivery, where you actually put a tube into this tumor and drop chemotherapy in. And that's been very technically challenging and hasn't made much of a difference. So we've been looking for many ways to try to open up the blood-brain barrier. And the reason why this is even more important is that over the past 5 to 10 years, we've learned a lot about the tumor. We have molecular targets that the tumor seems to depend on, that if we could get drugs to those molecular targets, we could hopefully control the tumor. And now with immunotherapy, we might be able to better treat these children in combination with radiation or by itself with immunotherapy or the molecular targeted therapy. But we just can't get the agent to the tumor. That's why we were so excited when the entity of LIFU, low intensity frequency ultrasound, became potentially available. It still has not been used in this indication. And when coupled with something called microbubbles, where you put microbubbles in intravenously, it flows up to the tumor. Because you put the low intensity frequency ultrasound, you get the microbubbles really upset. They start bouncing around. They hit the capillary walls, and they transiently open up the blood-brain barrier. It gave us for the first time a window that if we could open up the blood-brain barrier safely for a while with using low intensity frequency ultrasound and these microbubbles, then we could rush in drugs at lower doses that might seep into the tumor, or rush in immunotherapy, or Russian molecular targeted therapy that would help the radiation, but maybe even more by themselves shrink the tumor and help the child. So these were some of the things that we were very excited about. The difficulty is that, as you heard, ultrasound has worked in other body parts, but you can't get it through the skull. So to try to do this in a relatively reasonable way, you would have had to take a piece of the child's skull out and then aim the low intensity frequency ultrasound to stimulate the microbubbles. With the new systems in place, the one we're going to be putting in at Children's National, that Dr. Desai will talk about a little bit more, we're able to do this to an intact skull, do the microbubbles, open up the blood-brain barrier, give the medication, watch the barrier close down, and then maybe even come back and do this again in 2, 3, 4 weeks. So it really is probably the most exciting development we have potentially for the treatment of this deadly disease since radiation, since 40, 50 years ago, and maybe the most effective if we can figure out how to make it work and work safely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Packer. So, Dr. Desai, JJ, please tell us about some of the adult indications that this technology is also being tested on.
Pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you for the invitation. It's always humbling to be able to sit across from folks like Dr. Packer who've changed so many lives, both at the patient family level, and think about using technology in ways to really make an impact. And our technology, it was alluded to in so many brilliant speakers before from the foundation and other focused ultrasound efforts, is really unique. And the purpose is to use energy in a novel way to help patients where we're minimally to non-invasive, and we're helping to solve the biggest unmet needs, which have been reaching deep into the brain and delivering therapeutic agents that otherwise can't get into the brain for the barriers that have been alluded to. We started using focused ultrasound where we have a dome that fits around a patient's head. There's 1,100 phased array elements that are computerized and can all independently move to locate a region in the brain through MRI imaging or CT affiliation. And they speak to each other and then harmonize. So when they're delivering energy, it gets to the same spot in the brain to create additive energy. And in the instances where we're approved in treating patients, that creates a thermal heat that will actually disrupt or destroy the tissue that's causing the pathologic foci. So in essential tremor dominant Parkinson's, and we have clinical trials ongoing in full Parkinson's and epilepsy and behavioral disorders that we're really excited about all around the world. And several years ago, we were able to have a breakthrough where with the injection of microbubbles, little perfluorocarbon filled kind of inert gas bubbles that are used in like cardiac echo imaging, when those are injected into the bloodstream, they go everywhere. They're ubiquitous, and we're able to pulsonicate them with low frequency energy that doesn't create any heat. And we actually cause a mechanical vibration and oscillation within the arterial beds, and in this instance, in the brain around a brain tumor. And we can open the blood-brain barrier for a period of time, typically somewhere between a few hours. And when we check again at 24 hours, it's closed again. It's sort of an elastic nature. And that enables a path of least resistance for these drugs that are in the circulation to get into an area of the brain. There's been a tremendous amount of translational animal work that shows you can get all the way up to 15, 20x the concentration of a drug into the brain with this process versus just injecting it alone into the vasculature. And so we're taking all of that information, and in adults, we're working in both IDE and IND trials where we're delivering small molecules and in some instances large molecules into the brain for primary and recurrent glioblastomas and other indications in metastatic disease. And DIPG, as alluded to by Dr. Packer, is a devastating disease that doesn't have any approved indications outside of radiation therapy. And so we need a better solution, and we're excited to be a part of that. And first and foremost, you have to be safe and you have to do the right thing for the patients, and then pair with the types of pharmaceutical assets that really make a difference in that disease state.
Thank you so much, JJ. That was amazing. We're going to turn into Mary Daymont. She is the Vice President for Revenue Cycle Management at Children's National and has been studying, ways that, we can work with the payers to reimburse some of the novel technologies at Children's National. So Mary, please let us know about, some of the strategies that you've been using at Children's National for with respect to novel technologies.
Very much. Generally, this is a two-phase process. Initially, with the clinical trial, we start out with the typical research billing processes based on the Medicare coverage analysis, where we segregate out standard of care, such as the drug in this case, and the research charges, such as the HIFU treatment. Once the FDA approves the novel therapy for reimbursement, there are three essential items that must happen in order to support billing. First, we need CMS to approve the billing codes. Oftentimes, they only approve these codes in January, so you might have the FDA approval in March, but not actually have a specific billing code until January the following year. Once we have the CMS approved billing codes, then we have to get Medicare, which is not so relevant to pediatrics, but more importantly, state Medicaid and commercial insurance coverage guidelines. Until Medicaid and commercial insurances provide the coverage guidelines, every case is going to be more or less a single case agreement. And then we also, as part of this, need a fair and just payment for the technology. And I use this is really important in pediatrics. And one example that I always use is we had one state Medicaid program that would authorize Spinraza, which had, a price of $92,000 for the drug. They would authorize the entire procedure under a code that paid us $900. So that's not fair and just payment, and that's also not sustainable. So, so the three big things are the codes, the coverage, and the payment. And once all three of these line up, then we can go ahead and move forward. In this particular case, in some ways we're a little fortunate because FDA approved the technology for 22 and older in 2016, and Medicare did finalize the coverage decisions in 2020. So once we get approval for pediatric use, we already have the billing codes in place. And so that's a tremendous help for us in terms of being rapidly able to address the issue around the codes. And then in terms of the coverage decisions, again, Medicare has already made a coverage decision for the technology, so that is a bonus. And now in private and commercial insurances are also making coverage decisions. Aetna just approved it for the adult population in May of 2021. So, now we have both specific billing codes and we also have a leg up in terms of the coverage guidelines. Again, all of this will have to be scoped out for the pediatric population once we get that FDA approval. And then the one thing we do, one of our strategies in terms of payment and coverage is we really strategize around the patients that are waiting for the novel technology. So we look at what patients are in the queue, who are their payers, and then we aggressively pursue those payers. And, if we can't get a coverage guideline in place, we really push hard for a single case agreement to go ahead and start at least providing the therapy to the patient. Because again, as has been highlighted in this discussion, this can be life or death. So we don't wait. We don't go after everyone. We really strategically focus on those payers with the patients that we have that would most immediately benefit from the technology. And then as we get through the sort of the pent up demand, then we start making sure that we have coverage guidelines from all of our payers. It's a complicated process for something that doesn't have a coverage agreement. Initially, what we have to do is use a clinical nurse case manager to work with the insurance company to get the clinical authorization. Often she's providing research data and white papers to the payer and having conversations to get the clinical authorization. Once we get a clinical authorization, then we can hand it over to our contracting department to negotiate a letter of agreement for the payment or a single case agreement so that we again get the coverage and the payment lined up. The good news is once the technology becomes a community standard of practice, the process is going to follow all other authorization processes for approved therapies, and then we're kind of skating along. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Certainly, I'm willing to answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you. This technology will go through combination product regulatory pathway drug device. So the primary review agency is CDER. Dr. Van den Enker, would you like to tell us about how, in this case, we go about some of the challenges with IND submission?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge with a combination product anyhow, but there is experience. So what you need to do, you go to the Office of Combination Products, and there they will help you to guide what it is. Is the primary mode of action the drug, or is the primary mode of action the device? And that will determine when you have to go primarily for an IND or for an IDA. And I think that's the important step. And we have a lot of people from the FDA, not only in the room here, but also online. I think they're working together between the academia and the FDA is, I think, very, very positive about that. In addition to that, of course, there is this research INDs and commercialization INDs. And the latter is for where you want to make it a real commercial product. And the only big difference there is that for the second part, you need to do an electronic submission. Otherwise, you can still do it by paper. But again, the collaboration with the FDA, I think, will help them tremendous to make the appropriate path, as I just explained.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, because we started a little bit late, we're almost out of time, but I would like to thank this panel. Thank you so much, Dr. Packer, Dr. John Van den Enker, Dr. Desai, and Mary. And wanted to be sure that we also let you all know that the 4th Pediatric Device Innovators Forum will be hosted by our colleagues at UCSF, Stanford Pediatric Device Consortium. If we can please put the slide up, you'll see the date of the next forum and the topic. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope to see you all very soon.